It happened just south of British Columbia in the Washington state community of DuPont as the train was making its very first trip on a new, faster route from Seattle to Portland. It was entering a curve crossing over the main interstate highway going down the U.S. West Coast when the train went off the rails.
Hey guys, what happened?
We were coming around the corner to take the bridge over I-5 there, right north into Squally, and we went on the ground.
Okay, is everybody okay?
I'm still figuring that out. We got cars everywhere and down onto the highway.
Of the train's 12 cars and 2 engines, 13 jumped the tracks, some of them landing on vehicles below, including 5 cars and 2 semis.
We know that we have multiple fatals in the train, no fatals on the roadway.
77 passengers and 7 crew members were on board.
I just grabbed onto the chair in front of me for dear life. My laptop went flying, my phone went flying. It was all the way at the other end. People were screaming. It was crazy.
We don't know yet what caused the derailment. Excessive speed, an object on the tracks, a structural problem, all things that may be investigated by the 20 U.S. National Transportation Safety Board officials that have been sent to the scene. And our Briar Stewart is at the scene tonight with more from the survivors and the difficulties that rescue workers had reaching some of them.
The images of the twisted aftermath gives you a sense of just what it must have been like to be one of the passengers on this inaugural train ride. And as some of them emerge from the wreckage, they describe just how suddenly it all went horribly wrong.
Things just started to tip over and as it was going around, and then all of a sudden just ended up on the side and everything went dark.
At first, some didn't grasp just how serious it was.
It felt like the train that came off the tracks or something, it was just going to slide and not be a big deal. But then the second part of the accident was like, just a ricochet from there. At that point on, it was like we're turning and spinning, and the train behind us hit us, and it was just like a whole lot going on.
A few of the rail cars plunged off the bridge, crashing onto the traffic below. Others were left dangling precariously above. Some cars were strewn across the tracks and passengers were trapped inside.
The one guy pushed out the window and I helped him get down and he helped me get down and we crawled underneath the train. And I could hear people screaming and stuff in the other parts.
This freeway, which runs from Canada to Mexico, is Washington's busiest interstate. This morning it was packed with drivers. A few of them rushed toward the mangled cars to help.
And then as I got further in where the trains had kind of capsized and the roofs had kind of been torn off and people had been dumped underneath the train and were pinned, the injuries were much more severe.
In fact, even after the first responders arrived, there were some cars that simply were too dangerous to enter at first.
It wasn't easy for the firefighters to get through. They were using jaws of life. They were using air chisels.
There are reports that the train was traveling as fast as 128 kilometers an hour on a curve where the speed limit was less than 50 kilometers an hour. Amtrak wouldn't comment on whether speed was to blame.
I can tell you that it's being investigated by NTSB, and anything beyond that right now until their findings are out is pure speculation.
And Brian joins us now from the scene of the derailment. Describe for us what's going on there.
Well, Ian, I'm just north of where the train went off the tracks, and if you see the flashing lights behind me, you can tell that the southbound lanes are still closed, and they will stay that way for hours, possibly days, as the investigation continues. Tonight, officials have confirmed that they've been able to search all of the rail cars looking for passengers, and that cranes are being brought in to help move them.
We mentioned, Briar, this was the first trip on a new, faster route between the cities of Seattle and Portland. And so how much testing was done on the line before today?
Well, Amtrak says that in recent weeks there were inspection and testing and trial runs done on this new line, and that all of those records will be part of the investigation. We know that officials with the National Transportation Safety Board are now on scene. As mentioned, this was the inaugural ride of this new train line, and it was the first time paying passengers were on board, but there were politicians and dignitaries that were on this route on Friday, and that was part of the opening celebrations. Ian, it is worth noting that as bad as this derailment was, officials say it could have been worse. That's because there were 77 passengers on board at the time, but the train was nowhere near full.
All right, thank you, Briar. Briar Stewart near DuPont, south of Seattle, Washington, tonight. Well, joining us now is Ian Naish, a rail safety consultant and a former director of rail investigations for Canada's Transportation Safety Board. Ian, we're hearing various theories from media and sources in Washington State. Let's talk about a couple of those. The possibility, first of all, that this train may have hit something on the track. What would it take to create a derailment like this?
Depending on the speed of the train, and I think it was around 130, 140 kilometers an hour, something the size of a highway vehicle, like a Jeep, for example, would probably derail it. The railways do use highway maintenance vehicles about that size or bigger, which could be on the tracks. And there was a case in California, I believe about 20 years ago, where somebody parked a Jeep right across the tracks and got hit by a commuter train, and I believe that derailed then.
You mentioned speed, a lot of talk about that as well. Reports that this train was going at about 130 to 140 kilometers an hour on a straight stretch, coming up to a curve where the speed limit was about 50 kilometers an hour. It would seem kind of obvious that an engineer would slow down for that curve, but it doesn't always happen.
No, and this is a new track, I believe, and a new route, and maybe there's a possibility the engineer was not experienced on the route, possibility of distraction. There was a case in Spain with a similar kind of train about 5 years ago where the speed limit changed, and the guy came round a curve round about the same speed and derailed and hit a bridge abutment. So these things do happen, unfortunately.
One last thing I want to ask you about, a phrase a lot of us are hearing for the first time, positive train control, a system that the federal government in the United States wants train companies to bring in. They've been reluctant because, as I understand it, because of the cost. And in this case, the train did not have that system implemented. Would it have made a difference here?
If the issue was the issue of speed, it would have made a difference. There would have been a penalty application of the brakes if the locomotive engineer hadn't applied the brakes because of the speed restriction on the curve. If there'd been a large object on the track that was not detected by the track signal circuits, then it wouldn't make any difference. It'd still be a collision.
Well, we have the data recorder here. We have lots of investigators on the scene, lots of witnesses, so we'll start getting some answers soon. Thank you very much for your analysis.
You're very welcome.